He didn't even bother to lie well. That was the part that broke Evelyn Harrow, not the betrayal itself, but how little effort Lucian made to hide it. 6 hours into their marriage, while she sat alone in a hotel suite that cost more per night than most people earned in a month, her new husband was in another woman's bed. No apology, no excuse, not even a decent lie waiting for her in the morning. Just a forgotten tablet, one unlocked screen, and a message that rewrote everything she thought she knew about the man she had just promised her life to. If you've ever trusted someone completely, given them access to your heart, your future, your name, and had them treat it like it meant absolutely nothing, then you already know what Evelyn felt in that moment. What would you have done? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week we bring you stories like this one, raw, real, and impossible to look away from. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, and I promise it will, hit that like button so more people can find us. Now, let's go back to the night everything changed. The suite was called the Harrington, which Evelyn had thought was a good sign when she first saw it on the reservation confirmation. Her mother's maiden name was Harrington. She'd mentioned that to Lucian 3 months ago, sometime between the second date and the third, when they were still in the stage where small coincidences felt like the universe whispering their names together. Lucian had smiled when she told him. He'd tucked the information away, and when it came time to book the wedding night suite, he'd chosen the Harrington. She had believed that meant something. She understood now that Lucian Vescari was simply very good at choosing details that made women feel seen. It cost him nothing. It bought him everything. The champagne had gone flat by 10 o'clock. Evelyn didn't drink it anyway. Hadn't touched alcohol in 8 weeks, ever since the morning she sat on the edge of the bathroom sink at her apartment and watched a thin pink line appear on a test stick with the slow, inevitable certainty of a door swinging shut. She'd bought 4 more tests after that. All of them said the same thing. The universe, apparently, had opinions about the direction her life was heading. She was 8 weeks pregnant with Lucian Vescari's child, and she had planned to tell him tonight. She had actually rehearsed it, not in a theatrical way. Evelyn was not a theatrical woman, which was part of why marrying into Boston's most feared crime family had always felt slightly surreal, like wearing someone else's coat. She'd rehearsed it the way she rehearsed everything important, quietly, privately, running through the words in her head while she was doing something else, so they'd feel natural when the moment arrived. She had a photograph from the ultrasound appointment 3 days ago. The technician had printed 2 copies without being asked, as if she already knew Evelyn would need a spare. Evelyn had tucked the photograph inside the inner pocket of her overnight bag, between her travel documents and a worn paperback she carried everywhere. She'd imagined taking it out slowly, watching Lucian's face, watching that controlled, unreadable man she'd married crack open for a moment, just one moment, into something genuine. Instead, she was sitting at the window of the Harrington suite at 11:47 on her wedding night, still in her dress because she hadn't wanted to change yet, because changing felt like admitting that the evening was over when it hadn't properly begun. The city spread out below her in orange and silver, indifferent and enormous. Somewhere out there, her husband was doing something that did not involve her. She had called twice. Both times, it rang through to voicemail. His voice on the recording was smooth and professional. "You've reached Lucian Vescari. Leave a message." She didn't leave a message either time. The tablet was on the coffee table. She noticed it when she stood up to refill her water glass. Lucian's personal tablet, the thin silver one he carried everywhere and kept face down on surfaces the way some people kept their secrets. He must have left it when he stepped out, which meant he'd gone in a hurry, or he'd been distracted, and this possibility occurred to her with a dull, specific quality she should have listened to more carefully. He simply hadn't cared whether she found it. She almost didn't pick it up. That was the thing she would turn over in her mind for months afterward. She almost left it there. She'd been going for her water glass, not the tablet. If she had taken 2 steps to the left instead of 2 steps to the right, she would have missed it entirely. She would have gone to bed. She would have told herself Lucian had a crisis in his organization, which was true often enough to be plausible, and she would have found a way to believe it. She was good at finding ways to believe things that made her life manageable. She picked up the tablet. The screen lit immediately. No password, which surprised her, because Lucian was meticulous about security on his phone. The tablet must have been a secondary device, less guarded. There were 2 notifications visible without even unlocking it, and the preview text was long enough that she could read the first few lines of the most recent message without touching anything. Babe, I can't believe you actually did it. I thought you were bluffing about the whole wedding thing. Are you almost here? I opened the Barolo. Same room as always. The name above the message was a single S, stored in the contacts without a last name. Evelyn set the tablet back on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started shaking and you don't want to drop it. She stood there for a moment. The city went on below her, indifferent as ever. Then she picked the tablet up again, because she needed to be sure. She needed to see it again. Because there is a part of the human mind that will construct alternate explanations until the evidence becomes truly, irrefutably impossible to reframe, and Evelyn's mind was working very hard right now. Same room as always. It could mean a restaurant, a hotel that someone in his organization always booked, a meeting room. It could mean almost anything. I can't believe you actually did it. That part was harder to reframe. Her finger hovered over the notification. She was aware distantly that she was making a choice. Opening someone's messages was a line. She knew that. She'd believed, up until approximately 40 seconds ago, that she would never cross it. She believed in privacy. She believed in the basic human right not to be surveilled by the person who claimed to love you. She tapped the notification. The conversation opened. There was a great deal of it, months and months of it, scrolling back farther than she'd expected, and she didn't read all of it. She couldn't have, not standing there in her wedding dress with the champagne going flat behind her. But she read enough. She read far more than enough. She read the messages from 3 weeks ago when Lucian had promised S that the marriage was temporary, a move he needed to make for the business, nothing that changed anything between them. She read the messages from the day he proposed to Evelyn, when he had apparently gone directly from her apartment to wherever S lived and explained, with what sounded like genuine tenderness, that this was just a strategy. She's useful, he had written. The Harrow name carries weight with certain people we need to bring on side. 2, maybe 3 years. Then I'll find a way to restructure. You're not losing me. She's useful. Evelyn read those 2 words 3 times. The Harrow name. Her family. Her grandmother's legacy. Her father's reputation. The decades of quiet, respected work that her family had built in this city. All of it had been, to Lucian Vescari, a resource to be acquired. She had been a resource to be acquired. She put the tablet down for the second time. She walked to the bathroom. She ran cold water over her wrists, which was something her mother used to tell her to do when she was overwhelmed. Her mother was a practical woman who believed that the body had to be managed before the mind could think clearly. Evelyn stood there for 2 minutes, cold water running, looking at herself in the mirror above the sink. She looked like a bride. She still looked exactly like a bride. The dress had held up. Her hair was beginning to come loose, one curl falling against her cheek, but the rest was intact. She looked like a woman on her wedding night who had stepped away for a moment. She didn't cry. She had expected to cry. But the feeling that came was something different, something quieter and much more dangerous. She thought of the ultrasound photograph tucked in her bag. She thought of the words she'd rehearsed. She put one hand over her stomach, flat against the fabric of the dress, and stood there for a long moment that had no name. Lucian had betrayed his bride. He had also betrayed the woman carrying his child. She walked back out to the bedroom, to the overnight bag, and she found the announcement she had drafted on her phone. A single message, just for him, with the ultrasound image attached and 3 or 4 words that she had chosen carefully and revised 4 times. She held the phone and looked at it. Then she deleted the draft. Permanently, without hesitating, the way you close a door on something when you've decided it's over. She sat on the edge of the bed. The suite was very quiet. The champagne continued to go flat. She thought for a long time, not frantically, not with the catastrophizing spiral she usually had to fight back, but with a cold, deliberate clarity that she didn't fully recognize in herself. She had always known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the life she was stepping into with Lucian Vescari came with risks. She was not naive. She'd grown up in Boston, knew the families, knew the names. She had loved Lucian anyway, or believed she did. Believed that underneath the reputation there was a real man who saw her specifically, not just what she represented. She's useful. She thought about those two words for a very long time. By the time Lucian returned to the suite at 2 in the morning, unhurried, slightly too relaxed in the way of a man who has had wine and company, Evelyn was in bed with the lights off. She heard the suite door open. She heard him cross the room. She heard him pause near the bed, probably checking whether she was asleep. She kept her breathing even. She kept her face still. He went to the bathroom, ran water, came back out. He stood at the window for a few minutes. She could see the faint shift in the darkness. And then he settled into the armchair across the room. She had a feeling he didn't sleep. Neither did she. But she lay there perfectly still and let him think she did. And while the hours passed and the city outside went slowly from dark to gray, she began making lists in her mind. Quiet, methodical lists. Things she knew. Things she would need to find out. Actions she was willing to take and actions she was not. She had married a man who treated people as instruments. She had married him while carrying his child. And she had exactly 7 days before the window she could already see forming, small and specific and precise, would close. 7 days before people in Lucian's organization, who were already watching the financial structures around their marriage, would notice that something had changed about his quiet, accommodating wife. Lucian Vescari had spent his wedding night calculating the half-life of his marriage. He had decided, with the comfortable arrogance of a man who had never been seriously surprised by anything, that Evelyn would play her role. He had 7 days to understand how badly he had miscalculated. In the morning, he was already dressed when she came out of the bedroom. He had coffee waiting, which was such a precise echo of a normal morning that it almost knocked the air out of her. He looked at her steadily and said he was sorry for disappearing last night. A situation with the Marchetti connection had required his attention. It was handled now. He hoped she understood. His voice was calm and warm. He was very good at this. Of course, Evelyn said. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. These things happen. The look he gave her then was brief, just a fraction of a second, a small assessment, as if he'd expected something different, more softness, maybe, more relief that he'd explained. She kept her face quiet and even and gave him nothing to read. He nodded, satisfied, and reached for his phone. She watched him over the rim of her cup and thought, he has no idea. That thought should have frightened her. In some theoretical version of this story, one where she was a different woman, softer or less certain, it might have. Instead, it settled into her chest like ballast, like weight that steadies a boat instead of sinking it. Evelyn Vescari set down her coffee cup. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at her husband reading his messages, utterly unconcerned, perfectly confident in the version of her that existed in his mind. And she began. She had one advantage, and she knew it was temporary. Lucian Vescari had never once considered that Evelyn might be paying attention. That was the thing about men like him. Not stupid men, not careless men, but men so accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given room that they stopped accounting for the possibility of being outmaneuvered by someone they had already categorized. He had categorized Evelyn within the first month of knowing her. Quiet, thoughtful, principled in that particular way of people who grew up with enough money that they never had to compromise it. He had filed her under manageable and moved on. He had not updated the file since. She spent the first full day of their marriage being exactly who he believed she was. She ate breakfast across from him and asked polite questions about his schedule. She unpacked her things in the suite with unhurried domestic patience. When he took a call and stepped onto the terrace, she sat on the sofa and read her book. Actually read it. Actually turned pages, because there was no point in performing calm if you were going to spend the performance staring into the middle distance and hoping nobody noticed. When he came back inside, she looked up and gave him a small, familiar smile. The smile of a woman settling into married life. He touched her cheek as he passed, briefly, and she let him. That evening, he took her to dinner at a private dining room on the 40th floor of a building she knew belonged to one of his silent partners. A business dinner dressed up as a honeymoon continuation, with 4 other couples at the table whose surnames she recognized from years of Boston society events. She wore the right dress, and said the right things, and laughed at the right moments, and twice she caught Lucian watching her with something that might have been appreciation, or might have been satisfaction that his new wife was performing correctly. She couldn't tell anymore. She was learning fast that she had been misreading his expressions for months, that what she'd taken for genuine warmth was actually professional approval, the same look he probably gave a lieutenant who'd handled a negotiation cleanly. At dinner, she barely touched her wine. She covered the glass twice, smoothly, redirecting the server with a hand and a quiet word about headaches. It worked fine. Nobody noticed. But Lucian's eyes moved to her hand on the glass the second time, just briefly, and she felt the attention like a temperature change. She kept her expression neutral. She talked to the woman on her left about an art exhibition at the Gardner. Back at the suite, she lay awake doing arithmetic in her head. She had approximately 6 days remaining, which was not a lot of time to do what she needed to do. She ran through her financial situation with the same methodical quality. She applied to everything, cataloging what she knew from the prenuptial conversations. She had not signed away as much as Lucian's attorneys had tried to get her to sign. Her own attorney, a dry and extremely competent woman named Patricia Voss, who had reviewed everything 3 times, had quietly pushed back on several clauses and won. Evelyn had assumed at the time that those victories were about protecting herself in the event of a divorce she never actually expected. She understood now that Patricia had been smarter than she was. The question was what she could access and how quickly and without triggering the wrong kind of attention. She needed help she could trust, and the pool of people who met that criterion was smaller than she would have liked. She called Naomi Serrano the next morning from a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel, using her personal phone on a public Wi-Fi network, which she understood was not sophisticated tradecraft, but was better than calling from the suite where she had no way of knowing what Lucian's security team might be monitoring. Naomi was a forensic accountant she'd known since college, one of those people who existed at the edges of your life for years. Christmas cards, the occasional dinner, a text when something reminded you of them, and who turned out, when you most needed them, to be exactly the person you'd needed all along. "I need to understand something financial," Evelyn said when Naomi picked up, "and I need it to stay between us." There was a pause. Then Naomi said, "How complicated is it?" "It involves a man who is very good at making sure the answer to that question is very." Another pause, longer. "Are you safe right now?" "Yes," Evelyn said, and meant it. Not because she felt safe, exactly, but because Lucian had not yet given her a reason to be afraid in the immediate physical sense. His danger was a slower kind. "But I need to understand what I actually have access to, legally, as his wife. Send me the prenup and anything else you have. Tonight if you can." Naomi's voice had shifted, the warmth still there but pulled back slightly, behind something more focused. "And Evelyn, don't talk about this on the hotel phone." "I know," Evelyn said. "Does he know you're calling me?" "He doesn't know I'm doing anything." "Good," Naomi said. "Keep it that way for as long as you can." She sent the documents that night from a secure email account she'd created 3 years ago during a contract dispute that ultimately resolved itself, an account she had never used for anything else, and which was not connected to her name in any way that Lucian's people would find in a routine search. Then she went back to the suite and ate dinner with her husband and listened to him talk about a restructuring deal with an interest and attention that she was no longer performing. She was listening for information now. That was different. The second day was harder. The second day was when Lucian started being kind. Not the smooth, strategic kindness of the dinner party. Something that felt more unguarded than that, or was calibrated to feel that way, and she genuinely could not tell which. He asked her over breakfast, about the restoration work she'd left behind when they got engaged. She'd been finishing a commission on a 16th century Flemish panel when everything accelerated, and she'd handed it off to a colleague because there hadn't been time to complete it before the wedding. Lucian asked about the piece with what sounded like real curiosity. He asked about the technique. He asked what she missed about the work. She answered honestly because lying about the painting felt like a waste of energy, and because there was something almost unbearable about the fact that he genuinely seemed interested. He was, she was beginning to understand, a man of real contradictions, capable of warm, specific attention in one moment and breathtaking cruelty in the next. And the worst part was that the attention was real. It wasn't fake. He actually wanted to know about the painting. He simply also wanted to use her family name to insulate himself from federal investigation while maintaining a 4-year affair with another woman. Both things were true. That was the part she kept having to sit with. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The work?" "Every day," she said. He nodded, as if something had been confirmed. "You should keep doing it. After all of this settles. Whatever studio you want, wherever you want to work. I mean that. She looked at him across the table. I know you do, she said, because she believed him, and that was almost the hardest part of all. Naomi called back the third morning. Evelyn took the call in the hotel gym at 6:15 before Lucian was awake, walking on a treadmill at a low incline with her earbuds in, which meant anyone who glanced through the glass door would see a woman exercising, not a woman conducting a financial consultation that could unravel her marriage and possibly her life. Okay, Naomi said without preamble. So here's the thing. Your husband is either very confident or very sloppy, and based on what I've read about him, I'm going to say confident. What does that mean for me? It means he gave you real access, not symbolic, not limited, actual joint control over several accounts that are structured under legitimate business entities. The prenup protects certain assets, obviously, but what he put in both your names as part of the marriage structure, he cannot simply move without your signature. And some of what's in those accounts. Naomi paused, and Evelyn could hear her choosing words carefully. Is enough. Evelyn, it's genuinely enough. If you move correctly. Evelyn slowed her pace on the treadmill. How carefully do I have to move? Very. If someone in his organization watches the accounts regularly, and I'd assume they do, anything sudden triggers a flag. We're talking about small movements, incremental. And we need to do it inside a structure that looks like normal household financial management, not a withdrawal. How long? 5 days, maybe 6. I have 5, Evelyn said. A beat. Then we start today. What do I need to do? Naomi told her. It was precise and specific and made Evelyn's hands tighten on the treadmill handles, not from fear but from concentration. The same focus she brought to restoration work, that particular kind of attention you gave to something irreplaceable that you absolutely could not afford to damage while you were trying to save it. She listened. She asked 3 questions, all practical. She memorized the sequence. Naomi, she said before she hung up, if this goes wrong, it won't. If it does, then I'll tell them I was acting on my own and you had no idea what I was doing with the accounts, Naomi said flatly. I've testified before. I know how that room works. Don't worry about me. Evelyn stepped off the treadmill and stood for a moment in the empty gym. You don't have to do this. I know, Naomi said. That's why I'm doing it. She was back in the suite before Lucian woke. She ordered room service and sat at the small desk near the window and opened her laptop and began. The 3rd and 4th days had a rhythm to them that was almost unbearable in its normalcy. She ate with Lucian. She accompanied him to 2 social events, one of which was a charity function that 3 federal judges attended, which she found so grimly ironic that she almost laughed. She smiled and shook hands and accepted congratulations on the marriage from people who had no way of knowing they were watching a woman dismantle it in real time from the inside. She asked gentle questions of Lucian's associates, the kind of questions a new wife might ask out of polite curiosity, and she listened to the answers with great care. Meanwhile, in the background, Naomi was moving money. Not dramatically, not in visible chunks, in the way water gets through old masonry, slowly, in small amounts, through paths that already exist. Each movement was structured under a category that the joint accounts were legitimately authorized for. Household establishment expenses, personal property transfer, consultation fees for a restoration project Evelyn had been formally retained for using the LLC she had maintained since she went freelance. The LLC was real, the project was real. She simply accelerated the invoicing structure and made sure the payments landed in an account that existed outside Lucian's reach. On the 4th morning, she had the first close call. She was sitting at the small writing desk when she felt it, the wave of nausea that had been hitting her intermittently, usually manageable, occasionally not. This one wasn't manageable. She made it to the bathroom and shut the door and ran the tap to cover the sound. And she knelt on the marble floor of the most expensive bathroom she had ever been in and was quietly, efficiently sick. And when it was over, she sat back against the cold wall and put her wrist over her mouth and breathed. Outside, she could hear Lucian on his phone. She flushed. She ran water. She rinsed her mouth and checked her face in the mirror. Pale, but not dramatically pale. Nothing that would cause immediate alarm if she managed her expression correctly. She turned off the tap and opened the door and walked back out. And Lucian was still on his call, standing near the window with his back to her. She went to the desk. She picked up her own phone. Her hands were steady. He ended the call and turned around. His eyes went to her face. "You look tired," he said. "Bad night," she said. "The noise from the street." He looked at her for a moment with that assessing quality she was getting better at reading. Not warmth exactly, not coldness, but something computational. Then he nodded. "We can move hotels if you want. There's a property in the back bay that's quieter." "This is fine," she said. "Thank you." That evening, before dinner, she was looking for her lip balm in her overnight bag and she heard him come up behind her. She turned and he was standing close, closer than she'd expected, and his eyes were on the bag. She felt something cold move through her, but she kept her hand still, kept her face still, and she realized after a beat that he was looking at the zipper, not the contents. He'd knocked something off the nightstand and was checking if it had landed in her bag. It hadn't. It was under the bed. She exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled, while he retrieved it. The fifth morning, she found the prenatal vitamins were almost certainly visible through the semi-transparent pocket of the bag, and she moved them without fully thinking about it. Her hand was already reaching before her brain had finished processing the risk, tucking them into a completely opaque zipper pouch, sliding the bag shut. It took 4 seconds. Lucian was in the shower. She stood very still for a moment afterward, looking at the closed bag and thought, "I am getting sloppy." She couldn't afford to be sloppy. She had 2 days left. That was the fifth morning. The fifth afternoon was when Sabine Arquette called. Evelyn almost didn't answer an unknown number on her personal phone. She picked up because she was in the middle of a communication with Naomi, and she thought briefly that it might be related. The voice on the other end was low and slightly accented, French adjacent, and it said, "I need you to know that I'm not calling to threaten you." Evelyn sat very still. "Okay," she said. "My name is Sabine. I think you already know that." A beat. Outside, through the suite window, Boston went about its afternoon. "I found your number," Sabine continued. "I want you to know it wasn't easy, which means he doesn't have it in any place I could access, which probably means he keeps his worlds more separate than I realized." A dry exhale that was not quite a laugh. "That's actually the thing I'm calling about." "I'm listening," Evelyn said. "I've been with him for almost 4 years," Sabine said. "Not the way he tells you I am. Not something small on the side. We were something before you, before all of this. And he told me you were a strategy. He was very clear about it. He described the whole arc, the marriage, the legitimacy it would buy him, the timeline for ending it. He laid it out like a business plan." Her voice was flat. Not bitter. Something more worn out than bitter. "I believed him. I'm telling you this because I thought you should know that you're not the only person he structured a story around." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Outside, a pigeon landed on the windowsill and then left again. "Why are you calling me now?" she finally asked. Sabine paused. "Because he spent your wedding night with me," she said. "And something about that, I don't know, sitting there, knowing what that meant, what he'd done to you, what he'd let you believe. I don't want to be the kind of person who stays quiet about that." "Have you been with him since?" "No," Sabine said. "I haven't answered his calls." Evelyn looked at the window. She thought about what it took to make that phone call. The nerve it required, the vulnerability, the uncertainty about how it would be received. She thought about a woman in a different hotel room, probably, also sitting very still, also trying to figure out what she was supposed to do with information she hadn't asked to have. "I'm not angry at you," Evelyn said carefully. "I know that's not something you owe me." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It isn't." A pause. "But thank you for calling." After she hung up, she sat for a long time without moving. The things Sabine had said, he described the whole arc, the timeline for ending it, he laid it out like a business plan, was not new information. She had read it herself, on his tablet, on her wedding night. But hearing it spoken aloud in another woman's voice made it land differently, made it real in a different register. Lucian had manipulated 2 women simultaneously, telling each of them a story that kept her manageable, kept her in a category, kept her from comparing notes. He had understood both of them well enough to tell each one the version of events she would accept. He had been, in his way, very careful. He had simply not been careful enough. She went back to Naomi that evening and confirmed the final sequencing. They were close. They were almost done. There was one final transfer that needed to happen the following morning, and then the structure would be complete. Evelyn would have access to enough independently that neither she nor her child would ever be financially dependent on Lucian Vescari for anything. After tomorrow morning, Naomi said, we need to stop. Any more movement after that, and we're past what looks like normal household activity. I know, Evelyn said. Tomorrow morning is enough. And then? Evelyn looked at her hands. And then I leave. That night, Gideon Rusk called Lucian. She didn't hear the content of the conversation. She was in the other room, reading, or pretending to, the book open on her lap, the words blurring slightly because she hadn't slept enough in 5 days, and her body was running on something more fundamental than rest. But she heard the shift in Lucian's voice. The first part of the call was normal, his usual register, the clipped cadences of a man who communicated primarily in operational shorthand. Then something changed. His voice dropped, didn't disappear but pulled back, the way a sound source does when someone physically turns away from you. She turned a page and did not look up. After the call, Lucian came to the doorway of the sitting room and stood there for a moment. She felt him looking at her, though she kept her eyes on the book. I have to make some calls, he said. Of course, she said. I'm going to turn in early, I think. He looked at her for a moment more, that computational quality again, that brief assessment. Then he nodded and went back to the other room, and she heard the low murmur of him making calls for the next hour, while she lay in the darkened bedroom with her eyes open and thought with perfect cold clarity about everything she had done and everything she still had to do. She didn't know what Gideon had told him. She didn't know if they were looking at the account specifically or looking at something adjacent, or if Gideon had noticed nothing and was calling about an entirely unrelated business problem. She had no way of knowing. And that uncertainty, that particular patch of darkness where she simply could not see, was the hardest thing she had managed in 5 days. Harder than the nausea, harder than the dinners, harder than watching Lucian be kind and remembering what she knew. She had 1 day left. She needed the morning to be quiet. She needed Lucian to leave for his supposed trip as planned, which she knew, now, meant another night with Sabine, who would not answer his calls. She needed 1 clear hour with the accounts, and then she needed to move. If Gideon had flagged the accounts to Lucian specifically, she would not have that hour. If Lucian knew what she was doing, even suspected, even had a partial picture, the window would not just close. It would lock. And she was carrying his child, and he was a man who had described their marriage as a business plan, and she had no intention of finding out what a man like that decided to do when he discovered that the strategy he had so carefully constructed was collapsing under him because his quiet, manageable wife had turned out to be paying attention. She lay in the dark and listened to his voice in the other room, low and controlled and revealing nothing. Outside, Boston moved through its indifferent night. She thought, 1 more morning. She thought, it has to be enough. And in the other room, Lucian Vescari ended his last call and sat for a long time in silence. And whatever he was thinking, whatever Gideon had said, whatever had shifted in the air of that suite in the last few hours, Evelyn lay very still and gave him nothing to find, the way you hold completely motionless when something dangerous is close, and the only thing standing between you and it is the assumption that you are not a threat. Tomorrow, that assumption would end. She was awake before the alarm. Not the kind of awake that comes from rest. The kind that comes from never really sleeping in the first place, from lying in the dark with your eyes closed and your mind running its lists over and over until the numbers on the clock finally reach a point where getting up feels justified. Evelyn had been in that place since 3 in the morning. By 5:15 she was already dressed, moving through the suite with the quiet, unhurried precision of someone who had rehearsed this in her head enough times that the physical version felt almost anticlimactic. Lucian was asleep. She could hear his breathing through the partially open bedroom door. Slow, deep, the breathing of a man with a clean conscience, or a man whose conscience had been so thoroughly rearranged over the years that it no longer kept him up. She stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to it. Then she went to the desk. The laptop open. The accounts accessed through the secure browser Naomi had walked her through setting up on day 2. The final transfer, the one they had planned and sequenced and checked 3 times, took 11 minutes to execute correctly. She moved through each step with both hands flat and steady on the keyboard, not rushing, not allowing herself to rush, because Naomi had said clearly that the one thing that would draw immediate attention was a transaction executed in a hurry. Incomplete fields, Wrong reference codes. The digital equivalent of a person running through a space they should be walking through casually. She walked through it. Every field. Every reference number, copied from the secure note she'd kept encrypted on her phone. Every confirmation clicked through at a pace that looked, to whatever algorithm might be watching, like a woman conducting ordinary financial business on an ordinary morning. At 6:24, the transfer completed. She closed the browser. She cleared the history, not because it would stop a serious investigation, but because it would buy time, and time was the only currency she had left. She shut the laptop and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window where the Boston morning was coming in gray and thick, the kind of early November morning that smells like cold stone even through sealed glass. It was done. The financial structure was complete. Naomi had confirmed it was clean, defensible, entirely within the legal framework of the joint assets Evelyn had legitimate access to as Lucian's wife. It would not survive a sustained legal challenge forever. Nothing did. But it would survive long enough. It would survive long enough for Evelyn to be somewhere else, somewhere with a different legal jurisdiction and a different last name on her professional registration, somewhere that Lucian Vescari's reach was long but not instantaneous. She went to the closet. She had pre-packed the bag 4 days ago, just the essentials, just what she could carry without it looking like she was leaving. And she had repacked it twice since then, removing things that felt like sentiment rather than necessity, putting sentiment aside the same way she'd been putting everything else aside. The ultrasound photograph was in the bag, the paperback, her professional documents, both physical and on an encrypted drive the size of her thumb, her grandmother's ring, which she had inherited and which was hers, regardless of whatever happened to any other ring she was currently wearing. She looked at the ring on her left hand, the Vescari ring, an emerald-cut diamond in a platinum setting that had cost more than most cars, and which Lucian had placed on her finger with genuine ceremony, looking directly into her eyes while he did it, saying her name as part of the vow in a way that had made her chest ache with something she had believed was love. She took it off. It came off more easily than she expected. Her fingers had gotten slightly thinner with the morning sickness and the anxiety and the irregular eating of the past week, and the ring slid over her knuckle with almost no resistance, and she held it for a moment in her palm. This small, cold, extraordinarily expensive object that had represented, for approximately 7 days, the life she was going to have. She set it on the nightstand beside the sealed envelope she had prepared 2 nights ago, when she was certain enough of her plan to write the words. Inside the envelope were 2 things: a photograph from the ultrasound, the spare copy, the one the technician had printed without being asked, and 4 words in her handwriting on a piece of hotel stationery, pressed hard enough that you could feel the letters from the back of the paper. You lost us both. She had spent a long time on those 4 words. She had written other versions, longer, more explanatory, more precise about everything he had done and everything she knew, and exactly how thoroughly and specifically he had destroyed the family he didn't yet know he was building. She had written versions that were angrier, versions that were colder, one version at 2 in the morning that was so precisely articulate it had frightened her a little. She had burned all of them, metaphorically, and landed on 4 words because 4 words was all she trusted herself to leave in a room where he would find them. 4 words was not an argument. 4 words could not be negotiated with or explained away or used to construct a conversation she would be required to participate in. 4 words was a closed door. She set the envelope beside the ring. She looked at both of them for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the suite door, and she stopped. She had not expected to stop. She had expected to walk out, clean, decisive, the way she had planned it. Instead, she stood at the door with her hand on the handle and her chest doing something complicated and specific that she did not have a word for. It was not second thoughts. It was not doubt about what she was doing or why. It was something else, something more surgical. The particular grief of closing a door on something that had been, in parts, genuinely real. Lucian had not been a fiction. His attention, when it landed on her, had not been entirely manufactured. The morning he'd asked about the Flemish panel, the way he'd looked when she described the work, that was real. She believed that was real. It made it worse, not better. That was the part no one told you about betrayal, that the genuine parts didn't disappear. They just became evidence of a different kind of loss. She opened the door and walked out. The elevator took 40 seconds. She counted them. In the lobby, she walked at a normal pace to the side entrance, where the car she had arranged 3 days ago was waiting. Not a hired car, not anything that could be traced to a service Lucian knew about, but a friend of Naomi's, a woman named Carla, who drove a 10-year-old Subaru and asked no questions, and had been waiting in the loading zone since 6:15 reading a paperback on her phone. Evelyn got in. Carla looked at her in the rearview mirror. "You good?" "Drive, please," Evelyn said. Carla drove. They were 4 blocks from the hotel when Evelyn's phone rang. It was not a number she recognized. She let it ring. It rang again immediately after. She turned the phone face down on her knee and watched the city go by and focused on breathing at a rate that would not alarm her body because her body was already managing enough. The phone buzzed. A text from the same unknown number, Mrs. Vescari. "This is Gideon Rusk. I need you to stop the car." She stared at that text for 2 seconds. Then she looked up and said, "Carla, change of route. Take the long way to the pike." Carla glanced in the rearview mirror, didn't ask, turned left. Evelyn typed back, "I don't know who this is." The response came in under 10 seconds. "Yes, you do, and I know what you've been doing for the past 5 days. We need to talk before Lucian wakes up and I have to tell him what I know. You have about 90 minutes. Her stomach dropped. Not metaphorically, physically, the way it drops on a sudden change in elevation, something almost nauseating about the abruptness of it. She had known, abstractly, that Gideon was watching. Naomi had warned her on day 2 that someone in the organization monitored the accounts. She had structured everything precisely to avoid triggering that monitoring. She had been careful. She had been so careful. She typed, "What do you want?" Gideon's response, "To talk, not to stop you. Meet me at the Archer Street parking structure, level 3. 20 minutes. She sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the back of Carla's headrest and thought for a very short amount of time, because short was all she had. If Gideon wanted to stop her, he would have called Lucian first, not her. If he wanted leverage, calling her directly was wrong. The leverage was telling Lucian, letting Lucian handle it, maintaining his own position by appearing loyal. Calling her directly was not the move of someone consolidating position with his boss. It was the move of someone with a different agenda. She thought about the phone call she'd half heard 2 nights ago. Lucian's voice dropping. That shift. She typed, 15 minutes. She told Carla the address. Gideon Rusk was not what she'd expected. She had met him twice in social settings. Large gatherings where he'd been present at the edge of things. A compact man in his mid-40s with the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that being underestimated was useful. He was standing on level 3 of the parking structure when Carla's Subaru came up the ramp, and he was alone, and he had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was not, as far as she could see, holding a phone or gesturing to anyone waiting out of sight. She got out of the car. She stood 8 feet from him and let him speak first. "You're smarter than he gave you credit for," Gideon said. Not a compliment, just an observation, stated flatly, the way you state a fact you've been sitting with for a while. "What do you know?" she asked. "I know about the accounts, the sequencing, the structure. Your accountant is good, but I've been watching those numbers for 6 years and I know what normal looks like." He took his hands out of his pockets, showed her they were empty. "I haven't told him." "Why not?" Gideon looked at her for a moment with those still, assessing eyes. "Because I've been with Lucian for 11 years, he said, and I've watched him do a lot of things. Some of them I could live with, some of them I told myself were just the nature of the business, and some of them—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that was not quite regret but was adjacent to it. "He spent your wedding night with that woman. I drove him there." Evelyn said nothing. "I drove him there," Gideon repeated, and this time there was something different in his voice, something rougher. "And I came back to the hotel and I thought about you in that suite, and I have a daughter, Mrs. Vescari. She's 9. And I thought about her growing up and marrying someone who—" He stopped again. "I'm not asking you to care about my feelings about it." "What are you asking?" "I'm telling you that you have a window," Gideon said. "A real one. I haven't flagged the accounts and I won't, not today. Lucian's trip is real. He's going to be out of the building for most of the morning. You have more time than you thought." He paused. "And I'm telling you that whatever you've put in motion, you should finish it, completely, before he comes back." She studied him. "You understand what you're doing?" "Yes." "If he finds out—" "He's going to find out anyway," Gideon said, and something in his voice shifted, flatter, harder, like a decision that had already been made. That's a separate problem. Yours is getting out. She understood then that Gideon Rusk was not protecting her. He was doing something more complicated than that, something that served his own purposes in ways she didn't fully have visibility into, and she was wise enough not to mistake his assistance for altruism. He was making a move. She happened to be in a position where his move and her exit were, for this morning, pointing in the same direction. "Is there anything else you're going to tell me?" she asked. "One thing." He looked at her steadily. "He doesn't know about the pregnancy." The air in the parking structure was very cold and smelled like concrete and exhaust. "No," she said, "he doesn't." "Make sure he learns about it from you," Gideon said. "Not from anyone else. Not from records. From you, when you decide, on your terms." He paused. "He's going to lose his mind when he finds out. And how he finds out is going to matter." She held his gaze for a moment. "Why does that matter to you?" Gideon was quiet for a few seconds. "Because if he finds out from a document or a secondhand source, the first thing he does is make it a problem to be solved," he said. "And I've seen how he solves problems. But if he finds out from you, even after, even from a distance, it lands differently. It lands like what it is," he paused. "Like something he lost." She nodded once, very slightly. "Go," he said. She went. Back in the Subaru, Carla looked at her in the mirror and said nothing. They pulled out of the structure into the thin November light, and Evelyn sat in the back seat and looked at her phone, and then, after a moment, put it in her bag because there was nothing left to communicate through it that needed to be communicated right now. Everything she needed to do in the next 2 hours was physical. Present herself at the right place at the right time, hand over the right documents, get on the right transportation. She had a flight out of a regional airport 40 minutes south of the city. Not Logan. Logan was the obvious exit, the one anyone watching would assume. The regional airport was small and slightly inconvenient and required a connection, which added 3 hours to her travel time. She had booked it under her professional name, which was technically also her married name, but which appeared on her work credentials and travel documents under Harrow rather than Vescari, because she had never formally updated those documents, having been married for 7 days. It had not been an oversight. She was thinking about Gideon's words, how he finds out is going to matter, and she was turning them over, and she thought about the envelope on the nightstand, the 4 words, the ultrasound photograph. She had spent 2 nights deciding whether to leave it, going back and forth, and she had landed on leaving it because she had decided she would not disappear into silence. She would not let him read about the pregnancy in a document years later, in some legal proceeding, stripped of all context. She would not let that be the story of how Lucian Vescari learned he was going to be a father. He would learn it from her. She would simply not be present when he did. The photograph would give him the image. The 4 words would give him the truth. And what he did with those 2 things, in the hours and days after he found them, was information Evelyn needed. It was a test she was not there to watch him take. But the results would travel back to her regardless, through the network of people and lawyers and arrangements she was in the process of putting between herself and his world. And those results would tell her things she needed to know about what kind of man Lucian Vescari would be when the structures he'd built to manage his life had stopped working. She needed to know that. For herself, yes. But more urgently, more specifically, for the child she was carrying, the child who would eventually be old enough to ask questions, and for whom the answer to those questions would shape the architecture of an entire life. She had to know what kind of man he was when he had nothing left to perform for. Carla pulled into the regional airport departures lane at 8:47. She stopped the car and looked in the mirror. Evelyn met her eyes. "Tell Naomi I'll be in touch," Evelyn said. "She knows," Carla said. Evelyn got out. She pulled her bag from the back seat and she stood on the curb, and for one moment the wind came off the open road beside the terminal and hit her full in the face, cold, raw, carrying the particular smell of jet fuel in November and the specific irreversibility of being in motion. She stood in it for exactly 1 second, then she walked inside. Security was unremarkable. Her documents were clean. She sat in the gate area for 37 minutes and did not look at her phone and did not think about the suite and did not picture Lucian coming back, walking through the door, setting his keys on the entry table the way he always did, and then standing in the silence of a room from which his wife had disappeared completely. She did not picture him crossing to the nightstand. She did not picture his face when he saw the ring. She boarded the plane. She found her seat. She put her bag in the overhead compartment, and she sat down, and she put her seatbelt on with steady hands. The woman in the seat next to her was reading a magazine and smelled pleasantly of lavender. The engine noise rose as they taxied. Evelyn put one hand flat against her stomach under the jacket where no one could see. "We're going," she said quietly, to no one, to both of them. "We're going." The plane lifted, and in the Harrington suite, in the silence of a room that still smelled faintly of her perfume, Lucian Vescari came through the door at 10:53 in the morning, set his keys on the entry table, called her name once, and heard nothing come back. He walked to the bedroom. He saw the ring first, the ring he had chosen, the ring he had placed on her hand with her name in his mouth, and something he had, in that precise moment, believed was real. It sat on the nightstand in the flat November light with the sealed envelope beside it. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. The ultrasound photograph came out first. He looked at it for a long time, at the gray-white blur of an image that required a particular kind of knowledge to read, but not that much knowledge. Not so much that a man of his intelligence couldn't understand immediately what he was looking at. He turned it over. He turned it back. Then he unfolded the paper with the 4 words. He read them. He stood very still in the empty bedroom for what felt, to the man who came to find him 20 minutes later, like much longer than it was. And Gideon Rusk, who had been in that suite lobby since 9 o'clock, who had positioned himself to be the first person Lucian called because that was what a loyal lieutenant did in a crisis, who had spent the past 11 years learning exactly what Lucian Vescari looked like in every state of anger and calculation and cold decision. Gideon Rusk walked into that bedroom and looked at his boss standing there with a photograph and 4 words, and what he saw on Lucian's face was something he had never seen before in 11 years. Not rage, not calculation. Something that had no name in the vocabulary Lucian Vescari had spent his life building. "Sir," Gideon said carefully. Lucian looked up from the paper. His voice, when it came, was almost unrecognizable, stripped of the smoothness, the control, the professional register that had never once cracked in 11 years of operations that would have broken most men before breakfast. "She was pregnant," Lucian said. Gideon said nothing. "She was carrying my child," Lucian said, "and she sat in this room alone on our wedding night, and she was—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She was going to tell me." "Yes," Gideon said quietly. "I believe she was." Lucian looked back at the photograph. His hand, the one holding it, was not entirely steady. This was information Gideon filed away with the same automatic precision he applied to everything, because he was Gideon Rusk, and that was what he did. But it was also information that landed differently than most. He had seen this man's hands in a lot of situations. He had never seen them uncertain before. "Find her," Lucian said. And that was the moment. Not the ring, not the envelope, not even the 4 words. That was the moment when everything that came next became inevitable. Because Lucian Vescari issued an order from a place of complete devastation, and devastated men with unlimited resources and a lifetime habit of solving problems through control do not issue orders that lead anywhere good. Gideon had known this was coming. He had known it since the parking structure that morning. He had known it, if he was honest, since the night he drove Lucian to Sabine's hotel, while Evelyn Harrow sat alone in the Harrington suite carrying a child neither of them knew about yet. He had made his choice in that parking structure. He had pointed Evelyn toward the door. Now he stood in the wreckage and looked at his boss and said, "I'll make calls," and went to do exactly that. And he did not tell Lucian that he already knew she was probably in the air, that he had 90 minutes ago made sure her window was open, that the calls he was about to make would be thorough and professional and would find her eventually, because they always did. That was the nature of the resources available, but would not find her today. Today she needed to land somewhere. Today she needed to be somewhere that was not here. Because Lucian Vescari, in that bedroom, with that photograph in his uncertain hand, was the most dangerous version of himself Gideon had ever seen. Not because he was cold, but because for the first time in 11 years he was not cold at all. And a man like that, burning with the full machinery of his organization behind him, reaching for the woman who had walked away from him while carrying his child, was capable of things that even Gideon, who had seen most things, did not want to be in the room for. She needed to be somewhere safe before the burning became a decision. She needed Florence, or wherever it was she was going. She needed to be already gone. The first 48 hours after Evelyn disappeared, Lucian Vescari did not sleep. This was not unusual for him. He had gone longer on operations that required it, running on coffee and the specific kind of adrenaline that comes from having too many variables in motion at once. What was unusual was the quality of the wakefulness. Normally when he didn't sleep, it was because his mind was working, processing, sorting through problems with the same efficient machinery he'd spent 20 years building. This was different. This was the kind of awake that has nothing to do with productivity and everything to do with a single image that will not leave, no matter how many other things you try to put in front of it. The ultrasound photograph was on his desk. He had moved it there from the nightstand. Not deliberately, not with any particular intention, more the way you move something you keep picking up and putting down without realizing you're doing it. It was a small image, slightly glossy, the kind of thing printed on thermal paper that would fade eventually if you left it in sunlight. He had not left it in sunlight. He had kept it in his jacket pocket for the first 12 hours and then moved it to his desk when the jacket started feeling like a container for something too large for a pocket to hold. He knew what the image was. He had looked it up, which was its own particular kind of absurdity, Lucian Vescari sitting in the study of the Beacon Hill house at 2 a.m, running an image search to understand what an 8-week ultrasound was supposed to show. And he understood now that the small curved shape in the lower quadrant of the image was a child. His child. A child that had existed for 8 weeks while he was making plans and running operations and deciding, with the comfortable certainty of a man who managed everything, exactly how his marriage would work and when it would end. His child. That he had not known about. That Evelyn had been going to tell him on their wedding night, in the suite where she sat alone for 6 hours while he was somewhere else. He picked up his phone and set it down without calling anyone. He had done this approximately 40 times in the past 2 days. There were calls he should be making, organizational calls, operational calls. The machinery of his empire required constant tending, and he had been tending it poorly since Tuesday morning when he walked into an empty hotel suite and found a ring and 4 words. His people had noticed. They were too disciplined to say anything directly, but he could feel it, the slight adjustment in the atmosphere around him, the way people moved a fraction more carefully when he was in the room. Let them be careful. He had nothing to give them right now. Gideon appeared in the study doorway at 3 a.m. This was not unusual. Gideon operated on a schedule roughly similar to Lucian's, had done so for 11 years, and had a facility for appearing exactly when he was needed that Lucian had long since stopped finding remarkable. Investigators have a general region, Gideon said. She used her professional credentials at a transit point. Italy is likely. Florence, Lucian said. Gideon paused. You knew. She talked about Florence. He had been looking at the desk. He kept his eyes there. She did a restoration fellowship there. She said it was the only place she'd ever worked where she felt like the city itself understood what she was doing. He was quiet for a moment. I remember that because I thought it was an unusual thing to say. I kept thinking about it afterward. Another pause. Florence. Gideon said nothing. Find the specific address, Lucian said. Don't move on it yet, just find it. Yes, sir. After Gideon left, Lucian sat for a while longer with the photograph on the desk and the study around him very quiet. The house was large and had always been somewhat impersonal. He had purchased it for its security features and its location and its basement, which had been converted to uses that a real estate listing would not have described. He had never particularly thought about whether it was a place a child could grow up in. He thought about it now, and the exercise was so disorienting that he had to set it aside and come at the problem from a different angle. The problem being, and he was forcing himself to name it as a problem because that was the only framework he had, that he had a child. Somewhere in Italy, in the second trimester of a pregnancy, growing inside a woman who had every reason to want nothing to do with him and had demonstrated over 7 days with a precision that he found himself involuntarily respecting that she was entirely capable of operating without him. His child. He looked at the 4 words on the hotel stationery, which was also on his desk, and had been since Tuesday. You lost us both. He was beginning to understand that this was not a threat. It was not leverage, it was not an opening to a negotiation. He had parsed it initially in those terms, because those were the terms he had, and it had taken him almost 2 days to hear it correctly. As a statement of fact, as a door that had been opened and closed in a single sentence. Not you will lose us if you do the wrong thing. Not you could lose us depending on what happens next. Lost. Past tense. Already accomplished. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the photograph. The paper had slightly bent at one corner from being handled. He straightened it without thinking. On the third day, everything else began to fall apart. I was already aware that the financial movements Evelyn had made were clean and largely uncontestable. Naomi Serrano's work, he'd determined by the second day, recognizing the structure from a distance with the same automatic competence he brought to recognizing moves in other kinds of games. Whoever Evelyn had called on for this had known exactly what they were doing. The money was gone in the legal sense, which meant it was simply hers now, and the only approach available to him was a prolonged legal challenge that would require him to argue that his wife did not legitimately control assets that he had, in writing, given her legitimate control over. He had consulted his attorneys. They had been tactful and thorough and clear. The position was defensible, but unattractive, and the discovery process in such a challenge would involve a level of financial disclosure that would cause him substantially more damage than whatever the accounts contained. He had told his attorneys to stand down. On the morning of the third day, a captain named Ferrero, who commanded 3 of Lucian's most profitable northeastern operations, requested an urgent meeting. Lucian took the meeting in the study, across the large oak desk that he had inherited from his predecessor, and kept because it projected exactly the right thing to people sitting on the other side of it. Ferrero was a man of 53 who had been with the organization since before Lucian took over, who had always been steady and deferential and fundamentally comfortable being managed from above. He walked in and sat down and was quiet for a moment, which was unusual, and then he said, "We've been hearing things." Lucian said, "What things?" "About the federal situation." Ferrero put both hands flat on the desk. Not aggressive, the gesture of a man trying to signal transparency. "About documents that may have moved." Lucian felt something cold move through him. Not surprise exactly, more the sensation of a piece of information landing in the specific slot your body had already been holding open for it. "What documents?" "Financial records from the Meridian accounts, and something from the Callaway structure." Ferrero paused. "Word is the U.S. Attorney's Office received a package, Tuesday or Wednesday." Lucian was quiet for 4 seconds, which was how long it took him to run through the implications fully and land somewhere he didn't want to be. "Who's the word from?" "Prentice, at the federal building. He's reliable." "I know he is." Lucian looked at the desk. He thought about Evelyn at the writing desk, the laptop open, the things he had given her access to because it had not occurred to him to give her less, because she had been, in his assessment, manageable. How current is the information in those accounts? Ferrero's expression told him the answer before the words came. Current enough. After Ferrero left, Lucian sat very still for a long time. Then he called his general counsel, a woman named Hartley, who had the particular gift of delivering catastrophically bad news in a tone of absolute professional composure. She confirmed what Ferrero had said, adding detail that made it worse. The package to the U.S. Attorney's Office had been carefully structured, containing enough to be credible and useful without being so comprehensive that it looked like a data dump. It looked like the work of someone who understood exactly which pieces of the puzzle the investigators already had and was providing the connective tissue. "This is not amateur work," Hartley said. "No," Lucian said, "it isn't." "Do you know the source?" He looked at the ultrasound photograph on his desk. "Yes." After Hartley, he sat with the phone in his hand for a while, and then he did something he had not done in a long time, possibly ever, in this specific configuration. He tried to think about this from Evelyn's perspective. Not strategically, not what is she doing and how do I counter it, but actually, genuinely from inside her position. He tried to imagine what it felt like to sit in that suite with a pregnancy you hadn't told your husband about and find what she found on that tablet. He tried to imagine carrying that knowledge through 6 days of meals and social events and conversations while simultaneously dismantling the financial structure of your marriage from the inside. He found, sitting there, that he could not fully do it. The imagination required was larger than he currently had access to, but he got far enough to understand something with an unpleasant specificity. She had not done any of this from a place of cruelty. She had not done it to damage him, not primarily. She had done it because she had looked at the situation with clear eyes and understood that the only person who was going to protect her and her child was herself. And she had done it with the same precise attention to detail that she brought to everything, because that was who she was. And he had known that was who she was, and he had filed it under manageable anyway. That was his failure, stated plainly. Not the affair. Not the manipulation of the marriage. Those were failures too, and he was beginning to develop a more honest account of them, slowly and without much comfort. But the specific failure that had produced this specific result was simpler. He had seen exactly who Evelyn Harrow was, and decided that the category she fell into made the question of who she actually was irrelevant. He had been wrong about that. He picked up his phone and called Gideon. "The financial records that went to the U.S. attorney," he said. "Handle Hartley's response. Whatever she needs, she gets." "Yes, sir." "And Gideon," he paused. "The address in Florence." "We have it. Send it to me directly, not to anyone else." A beat. "Understood." He ended the call and looked at the address when it arrived and sat with it for a long time without doing anything, which was not a thing Lucian Vescari had much experience with. Sitting with something and not acting on it. It felt like holding still in the middle of a current, technically possible, requiring more effort than the alternative. He held still. And then things got worse. It started with Gideon, which he had not expected, though later he would understand that he should have. The signs had been there. He had simply been looking in other directions. It was on the 8th day after Evelyn left. He was in the Beacon Hill house going through financial restructuring documents with Hartley, when one of his security people, a quiet young man named Reyes, who had a facility for intelligence gathering that Lucian had been cultivating for 2 years, appeared in the doorway and waited. Lucian excused himself. Reyes said, in a tone carefully engineered to convey information without conveying fear of the response, "There have been conversations between Gideon and the Fontaine family." Lucian was still for a moment. "When?" "Going back approximately 3 weeks. Reyes kept his eyes level. "Before your wedding." 3 weeks before the wedding. Before the wedding was before everything. Before the tablet. Before the ring on the nightstand. Before the photograph and the 4 words. 3 weeks before the wedding. Wedding meant these conversations had been happening while Lucian was in the final stages of planning a marriage that Gideon had been present for, involved in, apparently loyal through. "What kind of conversations?" Lucian said. "Organizational," Reyes said carefully. "About structure. About—" He paused, and Lucian could see him selecting the word. "Transition. Transition." Lucian was quiet for a very long time. Outside the study window, Boston moved through a gray December morning without caring at all what was happening inside. He thought about Gideon in the parking structure 9 days ago, helping Evelyn get out. He had not known about that yet. He would put it together later, from the timeline, from the car service records, from the 4-minute gap in Gideon's location data on the morning Evelyn left. He would put it all together, and the picture it made was complicated and specific, and in some ways more interesting than straightforward betrayal. But right now, he had enough. "Thank you, Reyes," he said. "Tell no one." He went back to the study. He sat down across from Hartley and looked at the documents and thought, with the part of his mind that never stopped working even when everything else was in chaos, about sequencing. He had a federal situation and a financial exposure and a lieutenant who was negotiating with his competitors about what the organization would look like after Lucian was out of it. He had a wife who was in Florence, 7 months pregnant. He was calculating now, running the weeks forward from what the ultrasound had shown, carrying his son or daughter in a city she loved, building a life that explicitly excluded him. He had, it was becoming clear, made a substantial number of errors over a sustained period of time. He could address them in the order in which they were screaming for attention, which was the instinctive approach. Or he could address them in the order that actually mattered, which required setting aside the instinct to react and thinking about what each situation actually needed. He chose the second. Hartley got the rest of the morning. They restructured 3 financial entities before lunch, initiated a voluntary disclosure to federal investigators on 2 matters where the evidence was already strong enough that disclosure cost less than defense, and identified 4 transactions in the Callaway structure that would need to be unwound in a way that was painful but survivable. Hartley was precise and unflappable, and Lucian found her professionalism, today of all days, something close to stabilizing. After she left, he called a meeting with 6 men, his remaining senior people, everyone except Gideon, and laid out without preamble what he knew about the Fontaine conversations. He did not perform anger. He stated facts and watched faces, which told him quickly who had known, who had suspected, and who was hearing this for the first time. The breakdown was roughly what he expected. 2 men who had known and said nothing. 3 who had suspected and made the calculation that saying something was riskier than staying quiet. 1 who was genuinely blindsided and showed it in a way that was transparent enough to be either authentic or sophisticated theater, and Lucian decided for the moment to treat it as authentic. He dismissed the 2 who had known. Not dramatically, he told them to leave the room and then sent Reyes to explain what their options were. The options were limited. He made sure they were communicated clearly. The 3 who had suspected he kept. "I need to know," he said to those 3 when the other 2 were gone, "whether anyone else in the organization is moving." What followed was 2 hours that Lucian would later think of as the most clarifying conversation he had in the entire collapse period. The 6 weeks during which everything he had spent 20 years building was compressed, reorganized, and partially dismantled. Not because the information was surprising, but because sitting in a room with 3 men who were frightened and choosing, under that fear, to be honest, produced a clarity that he had not felt in a long time. He learned things about his own organization that he had not known, some because they had been hidden from him, and some with a discomfort he was still getting accustomed to because he simply hadn't been paying close enough attention. He had been managing people as resources. That pattern apparently was not limited to his marriage. When the 2 hours were done, he sent the 3 men out and sat in the emptied room and was aware, with a physical specificity he hadn't expected, of how tired he was. Not operational tiredness, something deeper. Something that had been building for longer than the past 10 days. He thought, sitting there, about a thing Evelyn had said early in their relationship, a throwaway comment over dinner that he had not thought about since. The most exhausting thing must be never trusting anything to take care of itself. She had said it gently, without accusation, the way she said most things. She had been talking about his work schedule, specifically the fact that he never seemed to delegate anything he considered important. He had laughed and said something smooth about delegation requiring trust and trust requiring time. She had smiled and let it go. She had been describing something much larger than his work schedule. He understood that now. The way you understand things when the structure you've built to avoid understanding them is no longer standing. He dealt with Gideon on a Thursday morning. He had spent 4 days after Rhea's report deciding how to do it, which was unusual. Normally, his decisions about organizational discipline were faster than that. The delay was not uncertainty about what needed to happen. It was something more complicated. The knowledge of what Gideon had done in the parking structure 9 days ago, which Lucian had now fully reconstructed from the evidence, sat uncomfortably alongside the organizational betrayal. Gideon had sent Evelyn to her exit. He had bought her the morning she needed, and he had done it while preparing to negotiate with the Fontaine family about taking over the parts of the organization that Lucian's federal exposure would leave vulnerable. Both things were true. The man who had made sure Evelyn got out safely and the man planning his succession without telling him were the same man, and the relationship between those 2 facts was genuinely complicated. Lucian called him in on Thursday morning and let him sit down, and then placed on the desk, in front of Gideon, the summary of the Fontaine conversations that Reyes had compiled. Gideon looked at it. His face was very still. "How long have you known?" he said. "Does it matter?" "No." Gideon sat back in his chair. He looked, and Lucian watched this with the full attention he had perhaps not been giving things he should have been watching for years. Not panicked, not calculating. Something that was almost relief. The relief of a thing that has been held in tension too long finally reaching its conclusion. "I didn't think you'd find it this fast." "Reyes is good." "I know. I trained him." A short exhale. "I trained him too well, apparently." "Walk me through the Fontaine timeline," Lucian said. Gideon did. He was precise and complete, and did not attempt to minimize his own role or construct a more favorable framing, which was not what Lucian had expected, and which landed in a way that required adjustment. He had expected defensiveness, or calculation, or some version of the loyalty performance that people in Gideon's position usually reached for when they were caught. He got a clean account, stated in a tone that was more exhausted than afraid. When Gideon finished, Lucian was quiet for a moment. "The parking structure," he said. Gideon was still. "You helped her." Gideon said nothing. His expression said enough. "While you were talking to the Fontaines about transition," Lucian said. "Yes," Gideon said. "Why?" Gideon looked at him across the desk. "Because I drove you to her hotel on your wedding night," he said. "And I sat in the car and I knew what you were doing, and I thought about the woman in that suite. I thought about her a lot over the next days. And then I started watching the accounts because that's what I do, and I saw what she was doing, and I thought—" He paused. "I thought, one thing at a time, maybe I can do the one thing that is clearly right and figure out the rest later. And the Fontaines, that's a different calculation." "Tell me the calculation." Gideon's jaw moved. "You've been bleeding for 2 years. The federal exposure, the consolidation pressure, the alliance problems in the Northeast. You were holding it together through reputation and fear, and everyone knew it was going to give way eventually. I wasn't planning a coup." He said the word flatly, without drama, neither embracing nor rejecting its accuracy. "I was trying to understand what the landscape looked like if things collapsed. And the Fontaines reached out, and I should have told you immediately, and I didn't. That's the truth." Lucian looked at him for a long time. "Those are 2 separate things you're admitting to." "Yes." "One of them I could look past." Gideon met his eyes. "I know. But not both." "I know that too." He said it without flinching, with a directness that cost him something, visibly. "I'm not going to ask you to." What happened next was not the thing that most people in that world would have expected, partly because most people in that world were applying the wrong framework. This was not about what Gideon deserved in some abstract ledger of consequences. This was about what Lucian could actually afford. Not financially, not operationally, but in the terms that he was, slowly and painfully, beginning to understand mattered. He was done adding to the cost of things. Gideon left the organization that Thursday, permanently, completely, and with a clarity of terms that left no ambiguity about what the arrangement going forward would be. No blood, no escalation, no feeding a dispute into the machine that would produce things that couldn't be taken back. Just the door. And a conversation that ended with enough honesty in it that neither man left it entirely unrecognizable to himself. It cost Lucian considerably to do it that way. He was aware of what it looked like from the outside. The perception, in certain circles, that leniency in that situation was weakness. He was also aware, for the first time in a way he could not set aside, that he was finished caring about what those circles perceived. The circles had been wrong about most things that actually mattered for as long as he had been in them. The federal situation developed over the following weeks in the way that federal situations do. Slowly, then all at once. 3 operational structures were shut down. 2 were modified into forms that were legal or legal enough. Several people who had been on the organizational payroll in capacities that would not survive scrutiny were separated, and the manner of those separations was handled by Hartley with the same professional precision she brought to everything. Money that had moved in ways that should not have moved was accounted for, which was expensive in ways that went beyond the financial. His empire, by January, was a fraction of what it had been in October. He accepted that. He accepted it not with grace. Grace was not really in his register. He had built himself without much room for it. But with something more functional than grace, the understanding that the alternative was unacceptable and that the remaining question was simply what he was going to build in the space that the collapse had opened. In February, he received, through Hartley's office, a communication from an attorney in Florence. The attorney's name was Benedetti, and he represented Evelyn Harrow, who had reverted to her birth name by the time the communication was sent. It was a formal document, civil in tone, precise in language, outlining the terms of a legal dissolution that Evelyn was initiating. Hartley reviewed it and called Lucian and said it was, given the circumstances, a remarkably fair document that he should probably sign without attempting to negotiate. He did not sign it immediately. He held it for 3 days. Not because he intended to contest it, because holding it felt like the last thing he had to do before the chapter closed completely and the next one began, whatever that was, and he was finding the threshold harder to cross than he had expected. He had been a married man for 7 weeks, and an estranged husband for 6 of them. And the marriage itself had been a construction that he had built with specific purposes in mind, none of which had been love, not clearly or consciously, and yet. He thought about the morning she had described the Flemish panel, and the way the city of Florence understood her work. He thought about her hands around the coffee cup on the morning after their wedding night, when she had looked at him with eyes that told him nothing and said, "Of course, these things happen." I thought about what it must have taken to sit across from him at breakfast and say those words while knowing what she knew and carrying what she was carrying. On the 3rd day he signed the document. He mailed it himself, which was probably unnecessary and slightly absurd given that he had any number of people who could have handled it. He stood at a mailbox on a February afternoon and dropped the envelope in and stood there for a moment with his hand still in the opening, the way you do when you've released something and your body hasn't fully caught up with the decision yet. Then he drove to his office and went back to work. He had spoken to Hartley about establishing a trust, legitimate, completely separated from the organizational assets, structured in a way that would remain clean regardless of what happened to the rest of his financial picture. He wanted it in place before the child was born. He had done the calculation. Evelyn was due in late March, based on what the ultrasound had shown him. He had March 15th as the date he was working toward, and Hartley had the trust structured and filed by the 8th. He did not tell Evelyn about the trust directly. He had Benedetti informed of its existence and the documentation sent to her Florence attorney. He did not accompany this with a message. He did not know what he would have said. In March, 2 weeks before her due date, he booked a flight to Florence. He did not tell anyone he was going. He did not bring security. He arranged a hotel, not the most expensive one, not a statement, just a clean and quiet hotel 3 blocks from the address Reyes had given him, which turned out to be a building that housed both apartments above and a restoration studio at street level. He had looked at photographs of the building online, publicly available images from a design publication that had done a piece on the studio's restoration work, and he could see through the windows, in one image, a large table covered in the controlled evidence of someone's work. Pigments, brushes arranged by size, a painting on an angled support that he could not identify from the distance. He had looked at that image for a long time. He landed in Florence on a Tuesday. He walked from the hotel to the street where the studio was because he needed to walk, needed to move through the city that she had described as understanding her in a way that Boston hadn't, and see it and understand something about the choice she had made. Florence in March was cold and gold and slightly damp, the cobblestones darker than they would be in summer, the light sitting lower and more angled in a way that made everything look like it was being carefully considered. He walked for an hour before he reached her street. He stood across the road from the building. Through the studio window he could see movement, a figure inside, moving between the work table and something on the opposite wall. He could not see her face. He could see the deliberateness of the movement, the quality of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and is doing it with the full attention of a person for whom the work itself is its own sufficient reason. He watched for a while, hands in his pockets, standing on a street in Florence like any man watching any window, which was not the most dignified thing he had ever done, but was possibly the most honest. She came out at 11:45. She was not small, but she looked smaller somehow than he remembered. Or the pregnancy made her center of gravity different, or it was the coat, a dark wool thing that came to her knees and was not particularly fitted. One hand rested against her side in the way that pregnant women sometimes carried themselves when they weren't thinking about it. Not protective exactly, more like an acknowledgement of what was there. She was looking down at something in her other hand, a piece of paper, her reading glasses on. He had not known she wore glasses, which was absurd. He had spent months with this woman and not known she wore glasses, and that small gap in his knowledge of her landed with a specific and disproportionate weight. She looked up. She saw him. He watched her freeze, not dramatically, not a theatrical flinch, just a complete and total stillness, the stillness of a body that has received a piece of information that requires every available resource to process before any movement is advisable. Her hand, the one at her side, moved. The small, instinctive repositioning of a woman whose first reflex was to put something between a threat and what she was carrying. He felt that movement like a physical thing. He stayed where he was. He did not cross the street. He did not gesture or call out or make any move that would close the distance without her consent because he was standing on a street in Florence, having finally understood, at the cost of everything, that closing distances without consent was the entire problem. He just stood there. The street between them was not wide. It was the longest distance he had ever stood at one end of. Evelyn looked at him with eyes that he could not read. From here, fully. But he could see enough. He could see the exhaustion and the weariness, and below those things, not above them, below them like bedrock, something that was not softness, but was not pure hardness either. Something that had decided to wait and see what happened before it decided what it was. She did not run. She did not call anyone. She stood on the step of the restoration studio with her hand at her side and her reading glasses still on and the paper still in her other hand. And she looked at Lucian Vescari standing across the street from her in a city where she had built the life he had not been invited into, and she waited. He took a breath. And for the first time in his adult life, Lucian Vescari had absolutely no idea what he was going to say. Not because he hadn't prepared. He had prepared. He had spent 2 weeks on the flight over and the hotel room and the walk through Florence turning words over. But because every prepared version of this conversation had been constructed by the man he was before he fully understood what was standing across the street from him. A woman who had trusted him with everything, who was still standing here, who had not, when she saw him, stepped back inside. He crossed the street. He crossed the street in 11 steps. He counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind is running so many processes simultaneously that it reaches for something simple and concrete to anchor itself. 11 steps across wet cobblestones on a March morning in Florence, and with each one, he was aware of Evelyn watching him with the particular quality of someone who has decided to hold completely still until they have more information. Not passive, not frozen, just withholding, conserving. A woman who had learned over the past 5 months to be very careful about what she gave away before she understood the situation she was giving it into. He stopped 4 feet from her. Up close, she looked different than the woman in his memory, which had been running a version of her that was partially constructed from guilt and partially from the specific distortion of missing someone you have no right to miss. She looked, real was the word that arrived, inadequate and accurate simultaneously. Real in the way of a person who has been living an actual life rather than existing in someone else's version of events. Her face had changed slightly, the way faces do during pregnancy, a fullness around the jaw that was new, and her eyes behind the reading glasses were steady and watchful and gave him absolutely nothing for free. "You should have called," she said. Her voice was even, not cold. She wasn't performing coldness, which he would have recognized, just level. The voice of a woman managing something. "I know," he said. "I would have told you not to come." "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took her reading glasses off and folded them and put them in her coat pocket, and the small deliberateness of that gesture, the refusal to have this conversation while wearing reading glasses, the insistence on full clarity, was so entirely Evelyn that something in his chest moved in a way he didn't try to name. "How long have you been in Florence?" she said. "Since yesterday." "Where are you staying?" He told her the name of the hotel. She nodded once, very slightly, as if confirming something she'd already calculated. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He had not expected that. He had prepared for her to stay on the step, to make him conduct whatever this was in public on the street, which would have been her right and would have been, he understood, a reasonable choice. Instead, she turned and pushed open the studio door and held it in a way that was not warm, but was not exclusionary either. The door holding of a woman who has decided to hear something out before she makes a final determination. He went inside. The studio was... He stopped just past the threshold and took it in, because it required taking in. It was a long room with high ceilings and north-facing windows that let in the kind of light that restoration work needed, flat and consistent, and without the drama of direct sun. The smell was specific, linseed oil and mineral spirits and something older underneath. The smell of old paint and older wood. The accumulated olfactory history of things being carefully repaired. There were 3 works in various stages on angled supports along one wall. The large work table in the center was organized in a way that looked chaotic from a distance and revealed, up close, a meticulous internal logic, pigments grouped by family, brushes arranged by size and type, small dishes of medium covered with squares of glass to slow evaporation. It looked like a place someone had built for themselves, not decorated, not arranged for presentation. Built. The way a person builds a workspace when they know exactly what they need and have finally been given the space to need it without apology. "Sit down if you want," Evelyn said from across the room, where she was moving toward a small electric kettle on a side table. "There's a chair near the window." He sat. The chair was wooden and slightly uneven on the stone floor, and he was aware of it under him with an odd precision. The physical reality of where he was, what he had crossed an ocean to do, what was in 4 feet away from him making tea in a restoration studio in Florence at 11:50 on a Tuesday morning. She brought 2 cups. She set one in front of him without asking what he wanted and kept the other and sat across the work table from him, far enough that it felt less like a conversation and more like a proceeding. She put both hands around the cup. She looked at him. "Say what you came to say," she said. "Please." He had prepared for this. He had prepared for this more carefully than he had prepared for anything in recent memory, turning the words over on the flight and in the hotel room and on the walk through Florence, trying to find the version that was most honest and least self-serving, because he understood that the gap between those two things was where he had always lost the most ground. He had arrived at something in the hotel room 2 nights ago that felt close to right. He opened his mouth to begin it. What came out was not what he had prepared. "I looked at that photograph every day," he said. "The ultrasound. I kept it on my desk and I looked at it every day and I kept thinking about the fact that you were going to tell me that night. You had it in your bag. You'd planned what you were going to say." He paused. His hands were around his own cup, and he was looking at the surface of the tea rather than at her, which was not how he had planned this either. He had planned to maintain eye contact, to demonstrate that he could do the difficult thing without flinching from it. But the words were coming from somewhere that didn't have the patience for performance. "And instead you sat there alone for 6 hours, and you found what you found, and you didn't run. Not that night. You stayed. You stayed for 6 more days, and you were—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "You were so careful. You were so careful about everything, while He stopped again. Evelyn was looking at him. She had not moved. Her expression had shifted slightly. Not softened, exactly. More like something had been confirmed, and the confirmation was not comfortable. "While you what?" she said quietly. "While I was making it worse," he said. "Every day I came back and lied to your face and thought I was managing the situation, and what I was actually doing was—" He exhaled through his nose. "I was making it worse. Every single day." The studio was quiet for a moment. Outside, Florence went about its business, the distant sound of a delivery vehicle, someone's shoes on the cobblestones, pigeons doing whatever pigeons did on March mornings in Italian cities. "Lucian," Evelyn said. Her voice was careful. "Why are you here?" "To apologize." "You could have sent a letter for that." "I know." "Or had your attorney communicate through mine. You've been doing that." "I know." "So why are you here?" He looked up from the tea. He looked at her directly, which was what he had planned to do and what he had failed to do when the words came out wrong. And he let her see what was there, which was not a comfortable thing to let anyone see, and was especially not comfortable when the person was Evelyn Harrow, who had demonstrated a remarkable facility for seeing what was actually in front of her, rather than what she was being invited to see. "Because I wanted to apologize in a way that cost me something," he said. "Because every other way, letters, attorneys, communication through channels, it's all managed, it's all controlled. It's me deciding what you receive and in what form and at what remove, and that's—" He stopped. "That's the whole problem. That's been the whole problem the entire time. I've been deciding what everyone receives and in what form, including you, including what I let you believe our marriage was." Evelyn was quiet. One hand had moved from the cup to the edge of the work table, not gripping it, just resting there, a slight change in how she was holding herself. "Tell me about Sabine," she said. He had expected this question. He had expected it to be harder to answer than it was. He told her, cleanly, without minimizing, without constructing a frame that made him look better than he was. He told her the 4 years, the nature of it, the things he had told Sabine about the marriage and why. He told her that Sabine had called Evelyn, which he had found out 3 weeks after Evelyn left through a detail in the phone records his security team had reviewed, and that when he found out he had felt something for which he did not have a good word, something like the specific shame of understanding that the woman he'd been protecting himself from accountability to had already learned everything from a third party. "She called me," Evelyn confirmed. On the 5th day. I know. She told me you described the marriage like a business plan. Yes, he said. I did. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Were you in love with her? He thought about that honestly, which required setting aside several easier answers. I don't know, he finally said. I thought what we had was honest, because she knew what I was. She knew the full picture. I thought that made it something more real than what most people had. He paused. I understand now that I was using the idea of honesty with her to justify not offering it to anyone else. You weren't honest with her either, Evelyn said. She thought she mattered to you. She did matter to me. Not enough to be honest about what you were actually planning to do with the marriage. Not enough to tell her that you were going to play it out for 2 years and then make choices based on what was most convenient for you. Her voice was not raised. It was very quiet and very specific. The voice of someone who has had months to sit with these facts and has them arranged with precision. You were managing her too. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't agreement. Have you spoken to her since? Evelyn asked. No. Does she know where things stand? Her choice, he said. She stopped answering my calls. I respected that. Evelyn nodded slowly, looking at her cup. Something was moving across her face. Not sympathy, not quite, but something adjacent. The recognition of another woman in a position she herself understood from the inside. What do you want? Evelyn said. Not the apology. You came all the way here, you're sitting in my studio, so tell me what you actually want. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to know my child. The words sat in the studio air between them. Evelyn's hand on the work table moved slightly. A small, reflexive contraction, there and gone. She looked at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, assessing, calculating, feeling something she was not prepared to let him see the full weight of yet. On what terms? She said. Yours. She looked at him sharply. That had not been what she expected. I've already instructed my attorneys, he said. Benedetti should have received the documentation by now. I'm not contesting custody. I'm not seeking primary guardianship. Whatever you've built here, whatever life you're making, I'm not going to reach into that and disrupt it because I have the resources to do so. He paused. I did have the resources to do that. I gave the order once, in the first hour after I found the envelope. He held her gaze. I canceled it. I know, she said quietly. That surprised him. How? Because I'm still here, she said simply. If you hadn't canceled it, I wouldn't still be here. I would have known, and I would have moved. She looked at him steadily. I had contingencies. Of course she had. He would have expected nothing less by now, and the fact that he could think that and feel something that was almost admiration rather than affront was evidence, he supposed, of how much had changed. Why did you cancel it? She asked. He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I was standing in that bedroom with that photograph, he said, and I thought about what it would mean for you to be dragged back. What the first thing our child learned about their father would be. He paused. I didn't want that to be the answer to who I am. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She stood up, moved with the careful, redistributed balance of a woman in her 3rd trimester, and went to the window. She stood there with her back to him for a moment, looking at the street below, and he waited because that was what this required. Waiting without filling the silence, and he was not particularly good at that, and was doing it anyway. I'm due in 3 weeks, she said to the window. I know. I'm not asking you to be here for it. I know. But I'm not. She stopped. She turned around. Her face had changed, the composure still there, but with something showing at the edges. Not weakness, something more honest than weakness. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has been strong for 5 months without a break, and is standing in a room with the source of the problem and is trying to determine whether the problem has changed. I'm not going to make this simple, she said. I want you to understand that. There is no version of this where you show up in Florence and apologize and we find some clean resolution. That's not what this is. I'm not looking for a clean resolution, he said. Then what are you looking for? A start, he said. Whatever the smallest, most legitimate version of a start looks like. That's what I came to ask for. She looked at him. Outside, someone was playing an instrument somewhere. the distant drifting sound of it coming through the old walls of the building, something stringed, something that had no particular opinion about what was happening in the studio and was simply present in the way that music is present in old European cities, woven into the stone. "There are things I need to say," Evelyn said, "before we go any further." "All right." She came back to the table. She sat down, not across from him this time, but at the corner, closer, which he noticed and did not comment on. She put both hands flat on the work table and looked at them for a moment and then looked up. "I loved you," she said. "I know that's an uncomfortable thing to put in the room, but I need to say it. So we're both clear on what it means that you did what you did. I wasn't naive about who you were. I knew your name. I knew what it meant. I chose you anyway because I believed there was something real underneath the apparatus of your life, and I was right about that." She paused. "I was just wrong about whether you'd ever choose it over the apparatus." He took that in without deflecting it. "What I did," she continued, "with the accounts and the documents, I'm not apologizing for that. I'm not asking you to. The federal documents especially," she said, and her voice was level and clear. "I want to be honest with you about what my intention was. I wasn't trying to destroy you. I was trying to make sure you couldn't simply reach in and take things back. I needed consequences that I didn't control to be in motion. I needed it to not just be about what you decided to do." He nodded. "Does that anger you?" she said. "Yes," he said honestly. "Some of it. The organizational exposure cost people who weren't me." He paused. "But I also understand that I had put you in a position where you had no lever that I didn't also control, and that the alternative was you walking away with nothing and trusting that I would behave well afterward, and you had no evidence that I would." "No," she said. "I didn't. So no, I'm not angry at you." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Tell me about Gideon." He told her. He told her everything, the Fontaine conversations, the parking structure, what Reyes had found, the meeting on Thursday morning, how it had ended. He told her that Gideon had confirmed it, all of it, and that the manner in which he'd confirmed it, without theater, without self-serving framing, just the plain account stated by a man who had made his choices and was prepared to stand in what they'd cost him, had been, ironically, the most honest conversation Lucian had had with a member of his organization in years. "He helped me," Evelyn said. "He didn't have to." "I know." "Is he all right?" The question surprised him. The extension of care toward a man she had met twice in formal social settings, who had helped her primarily because it aligned with his own agenda. It was so entirely Evelyn that he felt the reality of her sitting across from him with a freshness that the 5 months of distance had apparently not diminished. "He's," Lucian paused, considering, "managing. He has a daughter. I believe that's where his attention is." He paused again. "I made sure the exit was clean enough that he has options." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "That was decent of you." "It was the right thing to do," he said. "Those are different." He paused. "I've been trying to do fewer things that are strategically decent and more things that are right. It's a slower way to work." Something moved across her face. Not a smile, but the precursor to one, quickly managed. "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat for a while without speaking. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was something more complicated and more honest than comfort, the silence of two people sitting with the full weight of everything that had happened without trying to manage it into something more acceptable. Evelyn said, eventually, "You should know what I've named him." The pronoun landed in Lucian's chest like a dropped stone hitting water. "Him," he said. "Adrian," she said. "Adrian Harrow." She watched his face as she said the second word. "I kept Harrow, professionally and personally. I'm sorry if that—" "Don't apologize," he said. His voice had come out rougher than he intended. He cleared it. "Adrian Harrow is a good name." "He kicks at night," she said. And then, in a voice that had dropped its careful management slightly, something underneath showing through like the structure of a thing beneath its surface. He's very present. That's the only way I can describe it. I'll be in the middle of working and he'll just remind me he's there." She stopped. Her hand had moved to her stomach without her noticing, or she had let him see it, and he wasn't sure which. "I talk to him when I'm working. I know that's—" "It isn't," he said. She looked at him. It isn't anything except right, he said. Evelyn's jaw moved slightly. She looked back at the work table. The moment had been too close to something neither of them had the right to yet, and they both felt it, and they both moved carefully back from the edge of it. The trust you established, she said after a moment. Benedetti confirmed receipt. It's clean, she said. I had it reviewed independently. It's… She stopped. Thank you for making sure it was clean. It's his, Lucian said. It should be clean. She nodded. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer it honestly, and whatever the answer is, I'll accept it. She looked at him. When Adrian is old enough to ask about me, he said, what will you tell him? The question sat between them for a long moment. Evelyn looked at the table. She turned her cup slightly, an eighth of a turn, and back. She was thinking, genuinely thinking, not managing the answer, actually working through it, and he watched her do that and felt something he didn't have a name for. I'll tell him the truth, she said finally. In pieces, as he's ready for them. I'll tell him that his father was someone who knew how to be powerful and had to learn, late, how to be human. I'll tell him that's a harder education than most. She paused. And I'll let him decide what he wants from you based on what you actually do over time. Not what you say now, what you do. That's fair, he said. It's the only thing I have to offer, she said. I can't give you a place in his life as a gift. You have to build it. She looked at him steadily. And you can't build it by being Lucian Vescari of the Vescari organization. If that's what shows up, if that's the energy you walk in with, the control, the management, he will feel it, even young, and it will be exactly what it was when you did it to me, and I will not allow it. I know, he said. Do you? I'm asking to earn something, he said, not claim it. I know the difference now. She studied him. The restorer's eyes, the kind that looked at things and understood their structure, the hidden damage, the quality of previous repairs. He had the distinct sensation of being looked at with that specific precision, and he let it happen because whatever she was determining deserved an honest surface to work with. You can come to the hospital, she said, when he's born. Not in the room, but after. If you want to meet him. She paused. As his father. Not as anything else. He felt something move through him that was not an emotion he had much experience with. The particular quality of receiving something that cost the person giving it. Something that was offered not because it was easy, but because the person offering it had looked at the full weight of it and decided it was the right thing to do, regardless of the cost. Thank you, he said. I'm not doing it for you, she said clearly. I'm doing it for him. He'll know someday that you were in Florence. If I kept you from that first meeting, he'd have questions about it when he was older, and the answers wouldn't serve him. I understand. And Lucian. She looked at him directly. If you're not prepared to do the long, boring, unglamorous work of being a consistent presence, if this is something you're going to do for 6 months, and then let slide because your life becomes complicated and it's easier to send money and call it done, then I need you to tell me that now, because I would rather he grew up with a clear picture of who you are than grow up waiting for you to show up. The words were not cruel. They were the most serious thing anyone had said to him in years, and they were serious in the way of real things. Not theatrical, not designed to wound, simply true, stated by a woman who had done the arithmetic and arrived at the only answer available. I can't promise you I won't make mistakes, he said. I'm not asking for that. I can promise you I'll show up. I can promise you I'll be honest with him in a way that I wasn't capable of being with. He stopped. His throat was doing something he wasn't going to let win. I have things to learn about this. I'm aware of that. But I'll show up. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her tea and drank some of it and set it down. And something in her posture shifted. Not relaxed exactly, more like something had been decided. A formal determination reached, and the body acknowledged it. The hotel you're staying at, she said. How long is your reservation? Open-ended, he said. She nodded once. I'll have Benedetti contact your attorney about a framework. For visits. For communication. For how this works logistically when you're in Boston and we're here. She paused. That has to go through formal channels for now. I need the structure. Whatever you need, he said. She stood up again with that careful redistribution of balance. He stood too. The reflex of it. The old training of a man who had been raised with certain habits around women standing, which struck him in this moment as simultaneously irrelevant and the only appropriate thing to do. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a fraction of a second. Her hand, extended across the work table of her restoration studio in Florence, in the specific manner of a woman offering a formal acknowledgement to someone who has not yet earned more than that. No warmth in it, no hostility. The handshake of a door being held open at a measured distance. He took it. Her grip was firm and brief and real, and then it was over, and she stepped back and he understood that the conversation was done. Not in a bad way, in the way of something that had been as complete as it was going to be today, which was more complete than he had dared to expect, and he was not going to press past it. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He moved toward the door. "Lucian," she said. He turned. She was standing in the middle of her studio, among the ordered materials of her work, with the flat northern light coming in from the high windows, and Adrian Harrow's weight redistributing her balance, and her reading glasses folded in her coat pocket. She was not the woman he had married in the sense that he had understood that woman to be something he had characterized and categorized and decided he knew. She was the actual Evelyn Harrow, who had been here the entire time, and whom he had simply not looked at with sufficient honesty to see. "He has your jaw," she said, "from the ultrasound. The technician pointed it out." He stood very still in the doorway. "I thought you should know that," she said, "before you met him." He didn't trust his voice fully, so he simply nodded. Then he opened the door and went out onto the Florence street, and the cold March air hit him in a way that was not entirely unwelcome. And he stood for a moment on the cobblestones with the studio window behind him and the city going about its business, and the distant stringed instrument still playing something that had no investment in his particular afternoon. He walked back to the hotel. He did not walk fast. He walked at the pace the city seemed to suggest, which was slow enough to look at things. The old stone of the buildings, the colors of shutters, the specific way the light fell into the narrower streets at this time of year, low-angled and considered. He thought about a woman who had said that Florence understood her work, and he was beginning to understand what she meant, because the city had a quality that he was only now equipped to notice. It was a city where damage was not hidden, where the repairs were visible, deliberately, because the people who had built this place over centuries had understood something that he was very late to learning, that the history of a thing, including its fractures, was part of what made it worth preserving. You did not restore something by pretending it had never been broken. You restored it by understanding the break, and working with it honestly, and accepting that the crack would always be visible. He did not know if he could be restored in that sense. He was not sure the framework applied to a person. But he thought about Adrian Harrow, 7 months in the making, carrying his jaw according to a technician in a Florence ultrasound room, a child who would grow up with a mother who talked to him while she worked, and a father who was going to have to learn, starting from a very low base, what it meant to be present without managing, to love without annexing, to show up as something other than a version of himself designed to achieve an outcome. It would not be graceful. He was not a graceful man and was not going to become one. But he thought of Evelyn's hand across the work table, and the measurement in her eyes, and the things she had said, what you actually do over time. And he thought that he could do that. He could do time. He understood long games. He understood that the only things that lasted were the things built with actual materials on actual ground. He had spent 20 years building on everything except that. He had 30, maybe 40 years left, if he was reasonable about it and nothing went wrong, which in his line of restructured work was not guaranteed but was more likely than it had been a year ago. He thought about what he wanted to do with those years. He thought about a child learning that his father was someone who showed up. He thought that was enough to work toward. He reached the hotel. He went upstairs. He sat on the bed and looked at the city through the window for a while, and then he took out his phone and called Hartley and told her to expect communication from Benedetti and to handle it with the same precision she brought to everything, and to make sure whatever framework came out of it was the most generous version available to him, not the most protective. "Generous how?" Hartley said, in her dry, professional tone. "In every way she asks for," he said. "Whatever she needs to feel secure in this. Give it." A pause. "That's unusual instruction. I'm aware." "All right," she said. "I'll handle it." After he ended the call, he sat for another while, looking at Florence through the window. The afternoon was moving toward evening, the light shifting in that particular way it did here, going from flat to gold to something darker and more specific. He had a flight back to Boston in 3 days. He had meetings, restructuring conversations, the ongoing and effortful work of building something smaller and cleaner on the rubble of what he'd spent his life constructing. He had all of that waiting, and in 3 weeks, approximately, in a hospital somewhere in this city, a child was going to arrive with his jaw and his mother's eyes, probably, and his mother's precision, hopefully, and an entirely open question of who he was going to be in the world, which was how it should be and was not anything that could be managed or structured in advance. He was going to be someone's father. He sat with that for the first time without the defensive layer of practicality around it, without the framework of resources and arrangements and formal documentation. Just the bare fact of it, as personal and irreducible as anything he'd encountered in 43 years of living, and considerably more frightening than most of it. He picked up his phone and looked at it for a moment. Then he put it down. There was no call to make. There was nothing to manage tonight. There was just the city and the gold light and the knowledge of a woman in a studio 3 blocks away, talking to her son while she worked, and a man sitting in a hotel room trying to figure out what kind of person he was still capable of becoming. 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday morning in late March, Adrian Lucian Harrow was born at a hospital in Florence at 6:42 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with his mother's composure and, the nurse observed, without knowing the full significance, an unusually alert quality about his eyes from the first moments, looking at the world around him with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand what they were looking at. Evelyn held him for a long time before anyone else came in. She had been awake for 19 hours by that point and looked it and didn't care, her hair loose and her face without anything on it, stripped down to the essential version of herself, the way you are when something has just required everything you have. She held him against her chest and looked at his face, the particular face of a newborn that is somehow ancient and entirely new at the same time. And she did not cry, which surprised her, because she had expected to. She felt something larger than crying, something that did not fit inside the container of a single emotion. She looked at her son and thought, "You are not the consequence of what happened to me. You are what happens next." Lucian came in at 9:15. He had been in the waiting area since 5 in the morning, which she had known because the nurse had told her, not because she had asked, but because the nurse had mentioned it with a particular tone that suggested she found it significant. He had sat in the waiting area for 4 hours and 15 minutes without sending a message or asking for an update, which was what she had asked and which he had apparently done. When he came in, he stopped just inside the door. He looked at her first, briefly, a quick assessment, checking that she was all right, and she gave him a small nod that told him she was. Then his eyes went to Adrian, and that was when she saw what she had wondered about for months. What Lucian Vescari's face would do when it met something it had absolutely no defense against. He looked at his son, and his face just stopped. Whatever it normally did, whatever arrangement it normally maintained, it just stopped doing it. He stood there in the doorway of a hospital room in Florence, looking at a 7-pound, 4-ounce person who had been in the world for 2.5 hours. And he looked for the first time in any context Evelyn had observed him in, like someone who had set down something very heavy and not yet worked out what to do with his hands. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room. He stood beside the bed and looked at Adrian with the total, slightly helpless attention of a man encountering something outside his experience of his own capacity. Adrian was asleep by now, eyes shut with the complete commitment of a newborn who had found the first available opportunity, one small fist at his cheek. "Do you want to hold him?" Evelyn said. She had not planned to offer that. She had planned to say he could look, that this was the meeting she had offered, and she meant what she'd said about building a relationship over time through consistent action. But she was holding a child who weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and looking at a man who had crossed an ocean and sat in a waiting room for 4 hours and 15 minutes without sending a message. And something in her that was not sentimentality and not weakness, but was something much older and more pragmatic than either said, "This is the first moment. Let it be a real one." Lucian looked at her. "Sit down first," she said. "In the chair." He sat. She moved Adrian carefully. He was so small, she still couldn't fully account for the smallness of him. Even after carrying him for 9 months, the actual external reality of it was astonishing. And she placed him in Lucian's arms with the automatic competence of a woman who had spent 3 weeks reading everything available and asking the midwife 7,000 questions and was not going to let uncertainty about logistics make this awkward. Lucian held his son. He held him with a stiffness at first, the pure terror of someone who has never held a newborn and is treating the experience with the gravity it genuinely deserves. Then something adjusted. His arms found the right angle, Adrian shifted minutely without waking, and Lucian sat in the chair by the hospital window in Florence on a rainy Tuesday morning, holding a child he did not deserve and had not earned, but who was, regardless of anything, his. He did not say anything for a long time. Evelyn watched him. She was tired in a way that went below tired, that had no floor visible, and she was also more awake than she had been in months. The specific hyper-alertness of a new mother whose nervous system had reconfigured itself around a 7-pound, 4-ounce priority. She watched Lucian hold Adrian, and she thought about the woman she had been in the Harrington suite in October, sitting in a wedding dress with flat champagne and a forgotten tablet, and the woman she was now in a hospital bed in Florence having built, in 5 months, something that was entirely her own. She thought about the fracture in the old painting she had imagined on her last night in that suite, the visible crack, the damage that doesn't spread anymore. She had thought about it as a metaphor for herself. She understood now that it was something simpler and more literal. It was just a painting, and she was a restorer, and the work ahead of her was the work ahead of her, and it would take a long time, and it would never look exactly like it had before. That was fine. The before was not what she was working toward. Lucian looked up from Adrian. His eyes found hers, and they were different. She had thought she knew all the versions of his face and had learned over the past 5 months that she had known none of them with the accuracy she'd believed. But this version she hadn't seen at all. It was not soft, exactly. He was not a soft man and was not going to become one. But something underneath all the construction of him was present in a way it hadn't been, surfaced by the small weight of his son in his arms. He's... Lucian started, stopped. I know, Evelyn said. He nodded, once, and looked back at Adrian. Outside, Florence was getting on with the rain and the pigeons and the sentries of itself, completely indifferent to the specific Tuesday morning being conducted in one of its hospital rooms. The city had seen everything. It would see more. It had been broken and repaired and broken again in the way of things that last. And the evidence of all of it was visible in the stone if you knew how to look. Evelyn lay back against the pillows and closed her eyes for a moment, because her body had finally reached the point of requiring it, regardless of what was happening in the room. She was still aware she didn't go under. She wasn't going to sleep with Adrian in someone else's arms. But she let herself rest at the surface of things, and the room was quiet, and the rain was on the window, and there was the soft sound of a man breathing who was holding his son for the first time and learning something about himself that 20 years of building an empire had not taught him. She did not forgive him. That was not what this was. Forgiveness was a different process and a longer one, and she had not arrived at it, and might not, fully, and that was an honest thing to know about herself. But she could hold a door open at a measured distance. She had offered her hand across the work table. She had said, build something real, and let him see it, and let time do what time does. That was what she had. It was enough to start with. Adrian Harrow slept in his father's arms in a hospital room in Florence, and did not know yet what he had inherited from either side of him. The precision and the endurance, and the refusal to be managed from his mother, and from his father something that was still being determined, still being built out of the rubble of everything that had come before. What he had for certain, in that room on that rainy Tuesday morning, was this: 2 people who would not lie to him about what the world was, or what they were, or how hard the work of being decent actually turned out to be. That was the inheritance that mattered. The crack would always be visible, but the damage had stopped spreading. And outside, Florence continued doing what it had always done, holding its history in its stones, wearing its repairs openly, standing in the rain with the accumulated patience of something that has survived long enough to understand that survival and restoration are not the same thing, but that both, in the end, require the same essential quality: the willingness to keep